welcome to this week's edition of the Leadership Untitled podcast, the show where an expert from the world of L&D and or leadership comes along, shares their experiences and insights with you guys, and hopefully some of the mistakes that they've made along the way, so you guys don't have to make the same ones and can also make work a better place for everybody. My guest this week is Charles Jennings. Charles is best known as a co-founder of the 70-20-10 Institute, working with organisations to implement cultures that recognise and nurture learning on the job, flipping the traditional training room from being one of knowledge dumping to a more reflective space. Impact on performance is crucial to Charles, emphasised through the roles that the Institute has recommended to support this way of working, very different to traditional L&D departments. Charles has also walked the walk, spending 7 years as Chief Learning Officer at Reuters, so it would be great to understand his experience of theory versus reality as I welcome Charles to the show. Hi Charles, welcome to the Leadership Untitled podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk with you, Rob.
No, thank you very much for accepting it. Obviously, we've had a quick chat before today just about the sort of things we might talk about, and really my kind of introduction to you, if I may just say that, tell that story, was when I was working back at Sky, in my time at Sky. We had a director of learning that came in that introduced the idea of 70-20-10. And at that time, I think everyone in the organisation was going, "What's 70-20-10? What is it?" Quickly, we should all know this because he knows this. And that scrambling happened. And at the time, I went down to London to Learning Technologies, and you were doing a talk there on one of the days. And the thing that I absolutely loved about that, which we're going to get into when we talk about 70-20-10 more, is that you very calmly put the point across of what the model is, but you also talked about the importance of adapting it to the environment that you're in.
Yeah. So
to that point, you can call it what you want. Just this is a way of working. Here's all the different roles that we've identified in the Institute that work with this model. You don't have to have roles that are called that. You just have to make sure someone's doing it. And it absolutely made sense to me. And I went back and like the rest is history. I still love to work in that way. So I guess from my point of view and for the audience, how is it you kind of came across that way of working? When did you first understand the kind of 70-20-10 research, and how did that lead to the Institute?
Yeah, I'd always been aware that learning was more than training. Right from way back, I was, like all of us really, I was aware that, people learn all the time. We don't train people to do everything. I'm sure those of us that have children, for example, we didn't make sure that our child, as we wanted them to learn to ride a bike, we made sure that we didn't sit them down and teach them Newton's first law of motion, the law of inertia, because, we put them on a bike and gave them a push and they fell over, and we picked them up and dusted them off, and they got back on again, and away they went. Yeah. So it was really clear for me from right the get-go that people could develop expertise. People could become really good at whatever they did. And training was usually in there sometimes, but not always. And I grew up on a sheep station in Australia where I as a kid and a teenager, I worked with lots of people, who were real experts, really, really experts, who'd never had a day's training. They usually had a good mentor, someone they worked with who was their father or an older person. But it was really clear to me that if you want to develop, you have to have exposure to new experiences and challenging experiences. You often need to have access to people who can help you. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult to develop real expertise on your own, although it can occur, but it's unusual. And you also need something normally to get you going. So those are the three parts of 70-20-10. And in fact, quite a lot of organizations, you mentioned in the introduction that it's not about the numbers. Quite a number of organizations that we work with don't use the term 70-20-10. In fact, we've been working with Citibank, for example, for a number of years now, and Citibank talk about the 3 E's. How do we support people learning through experience, learning through exposure, and learning through education? So I first came across it, I was aware of some original research around this, which was done at the Center for Creative Leadership in North Carolina back in the 1980s. There was a book written about the study. It was a relatively small study of managers, successful managers, and the researchers asked them, it was a longitudinal study actually, asked them, how did they get where they were? And the answers that came back were quite complex in terms of there were 16 different categories originally as to how they developed. And then a guy called Bob Eichinger, who was working with the Center for Creative Leadership, he was at PepsiCo at the time, he looked at it and he said, well, actually, you can probably just group these into learning through challenging experiences and practice and reflection, and learning through others, and learning through formal training and development. And so Bob created this, what he calls a meme. And I think that's a nice term. We call it a reference model. We call it a framework. It's certainly not a rule. So I'd come across this and I'd seen it in practice at Goldman Sachs. This was back in 1999. Goldman Sachs had an accelerated leadership program, and they were using this 70-20-10 framework to help their leaders develop. And if you know anything about investment banking in Goldman Sachs, getting up the greasy pole to becoming a partner, becoming one of the senior people, that's really their big prize. Yeah. And I spoke to one of the managers at Goldman's who said that using this as part of this accelerated development program, leadership program, they had to demonstrate their ability, their focus and capability around developing their own teams, and they weren't given any time to do it. They were all really busy people because they do a lot of work. These people, they work long hours. Yeah. He said it was about the hardest year he'd ever had in his life, but terribly satisfying. So I was aware of that. Then in 2001, I was asked to come into Reuters, the big global information company, to help them develop a new strategy, a new learning strategy, because the CEO and the board felt that they were spending an awful lot of money on their training budgets across the world and didn't feel they were getting the value. So I came in and I had what I often refer to as the consultant's nightmare, in that I came in as a consultant and I did a lot of research, and we unearthed some really interesting facts about how the training budget was being spent across the world and what value was coming out of that. And then because 70-20-10 was in the background for me, and I thought, well, if it can be used in the way it's being used and picked up and used at Goldman's for a program. And I didn't really see 70-20-10 as just a sort of a framework for a program. I saw it as a framework for much wider things in terms of how we can help people develop and raise awareness as much as anything else about development on a wider scale. So we put in place at Reuters, we put in a new learning strategy based around not just formal learning, not just e-learning and formal learning and leadership development and so on, and coaching, which is formal, but about how we can exploit the learning that occurs, within teams through working with someone who's more experienced than you. How can we exploit all that learning that occurs through rich and challenging experiences, through working on project teams that are projects that are really successful or not successful or whatever. So we built a strategy around this, and then I was given the consultant's nightmare by the leadership team at Reuters, in that I presented the strategy, and Tom Gloser, the CEO at the time, who was a great guy, really, really focused on supporting development in the organization. So I presented this, and then I was, as I say, given this consultant's nightmare. They said, "That's great, Charles. Would you like to come and do it and implement it?" To which I said, "Well, actually, consultants normally just do the research, do the work, write the report, present the report. You give me the check, and we go away." But it was such a great company that I said yes. So then I spent 10 years leading the learning function and working at Reuters and implementing 70-20-10 there until the Thomson Corporation and Reuters merged, and it was pretty clear my role was moving to New York, and I wasn't. So so that's how I actually got into it. And whilst I was Reuters, I did talk about it at conferences and so on quite a bit, and quite a lot of others picked up on this. So, the rest is history. Since I retired from Reuters in 2008, I've been working latterly with the 70-20-10 Institute, and helping organisations across the world utilise this framework.
I guess it's going to be quite a loaded question in the sense that as a consultant, you went in, then they asked you to stay. So how much more did you learn about 70-20-10 by having to actually do it?
That's a really, really good question. Yeah, of course. I mean, the point is, Rob, that I think that, and it's backed up not just by this research behind this, but it's backed up. More and more research is coming forward to show that most of the time we spend learning, is when we're working, and we all know it. We've all worked on, for example, on projects that have gone absolutely brilliantly, and we've worked with great people. We've had fantastic managers or team leaders, or we've had the converse, where we've really slogged away at something and it hasn't worked, and we've sat back and reflected and said, hey, I'm never going to do that again. So, it's like anything, I think anyone's job, we all go through that, where as long as we've got some sort of level of insight, I think people who don't learn are people who don't have any self-reflection. You're not able to self-reflect. So doing it is really tough. It really is tough to do this. And I think that's one of the things that I feel very privileged, actually. And I think it's a real advantage to having been in the belly of the beast, in the heat of the, where I've had a whole team of, 200 or 300 L&D people working in teams that I was responsible for, and you can see the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. So it's and my previous work before this, I mean, until the mid-90s, I ran a research centre in the business school in Southampton. I was a professor of electronic communication, was my title. We worked in very early days of online collaborative learning. Before the web emerged, we were running online training programs and learning programs over old networks. I often refer to them as being cocoa tins and bits of string, and they were a bit like that. And again, that gave me great insight into the way in which people learn remotely, because a lot of these folks, we actually ran a set of programs across between England, France, and Germany back in the early 1980s, mid-1980s, on business skills and language skills. And so I'd always been involved in I guess, technology-based, thinking about new ways in which we can support organizations and learning, not just at individual level, but at organizational level, how we can support our organizations to become high-performing. And Rob, one thing I do know is that formal learning alone is never going to produce a high-performing organization. Formal learning alone is often necessary, but or sometimes necessary, but actually is not enough. And and again, anyone only has to think for 5 minutes about when you finished your college qualification or your university qualification, or when you walked out of that leadership development program, maybe that first level manager program. Are you a top performing manager, or are you an expert in your field? And the answer is, of course you're not. No. Of course you're not. And what makes you an expert in your field, if you're going to gain that expertise, is experience, practice, conversations and networks, and reflection. And it's time, and that's we can shorten the time. We can help people shorten the time to high performance. And that's what 70-20-10 is all about.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it just made me think when you were talking there that there's a quote, I think it was Oscar Wilde, that talked about youth is wasted on the young. It's kind of been embedded in a culture for so long. When you think about it, we've always kind of gone, well, I can try and teach my kids what to expect. I can try and teach them how to get through these years of their life. I can even try and teach them how to make the bed and tidy the room and wash the dishes. Doesn't mean they're going to do it. And how many times do we kind of go, do the older generation or do parents of children kind of go, you'll learn. And at that moment, that's the essence of what we mean by learning. And we've had a quick chat about this previously, that one of the trends in the industry, I think, over the last 20 years is that training teams and training consultants have become L&D teams, learning development teams, learning consultants. And I think, it was a much simpler, if not as productive time when the training teams focused on the training, because that's the 10 bit or part of the 10 bit. Whereas now, when we actually label ourselves as learning, we're talking about the 100, really. We're talking about the 100%, the whole learning experience. And I think in some ways, the label doesn't really help us in that sense, that the stakeholders we work with and for then think we're going to own the entire learning piece. And when we only produce a catalogue of courses or e-learnings or whatever it might be, they interpret that as being, well, that they will have learned everything they need then after that, will they?
Yeah. And I think that's right. And it goes back to, I worked with a man called Jay Cross for quite a few years. And Jay, was a great champion of informal learning, and I think wrote one of the best books still around informal learning, which he wrote back in 2006. It was published in 2006. And Jay always had said, the problem is that a lot of people can't separate learning from schooling. So we've been through school, we've all been through college or school or whatever, and often we revert back to thinking that learning is schooling, whereas schooling is important, naturally, but actually learning is happening all the time. And this is why, I see 70-20-10 as a way to sort of help take those blinkers off and say, hey, folks, people learn in all sorts of ways. People don't necessarily need learning and development and training departments to get better. But, if learning and training development departments are aligned with what we need to do as an organization to create an environment where continuous improvement is ongoing, where we're helping people to perform as best they possibly can, that's great. And sometimes that might involve some formal training, and other times it won't need it at all. And in fact, again, I'm sure, like me, you've seen surveys and so on that show that as people spend more time, as they move up and become more senior in an organization, spend more time in an organization, it's often said, in fact, I was involved in a conversation just a couple of days ago about this, where they say, oh, they need less learning. And what's really being said is they don't tend to engage so much in formal training. So if you go to your senior leadership team in any organization and ask them, when did you last go onto a formal development program, a training program, they'll probably look at you as if you're mad, because the answer will likely be not this year, maybe not last year, maybe not the year before. Then if you ask the follow-up question, say, well, what have you learned over the last year? You'll get a barrage of things that they've learned. So, it's about separating this schooling from learning, this training from learning. And a lot of we were talking earlier about the way in which we've changed the naming from being training departments to being learning and development, which I think is great. But in essence, a lot of organizations are still focused on training. So they've changed their names, they've changed their coat, but they haven't changed their practices and processes.
No, absolutely. And, when I think when we suddenly set our stall out and we are encompassing the 100 in the way that we work, or in our name anyway, there comes with that a responsibility to say we need to inject ourselves into the business, into the organization more. Because if we're not just responsible for this training piece here, we're actually really engaged and want to get involved in people's overall learning experiences. We need to start to influence that. And from a personal point of view, that's where some of the kickbacks come. That you suddenly need to engage more operational heads and leaders and senior leadership teams to actually want to work in certain ways as well, that have been led by a team that in the past for them has just been a bit of a support function. Is that something that you find when you go into those sets of places?
Absolutely. I think it's a big challenge for learning professionals to do things differently. As you say, it's about stepping away from simply designing, developing, delivering learning experiences, training experiences, or whatever experiences they are, formal learning experiences, and understanding and moving out and thinking about how we solve business problems. And business problems involve people. problems involve processes. Business problems involve tools. Business problems involve lots of things. And one of the challenges I see, and to be honest, some organizations are addressing this pretty well and lots aren't, is that they see every business issue as being potentially a training problem. In other words, due to the performer, not the environment. And actually, people like Deming Edwards and various others have demonstrated. I mean, W. Deming Edwards, great, very, very well-known American economist and so on. I think Edwards said something like 96% of performance problems are due to the system and not the performer, and managers have responsibility for the system. So, that's a sort of quite a nice sort of link into saying, okay, if we're going to solve business problems, we have to make sure that managers are really engaged in that, because often it's lack of process or poor processes or unclear processes, or objectives aren't very clear, or it might be that there are obstacles which are stopping people perform to what is required. And it's what we call in our 70-20-10 methodology, we call them environmental influences. Yeah, environmental factors, and yet a lot of L&Ds still see, when they're addressing those problems, they see the skills as being a problem, or the capability as being a problem. And to be honest, that bothers me a little bit, because at the moment we've got this huge sort of volcano of focus on skills, and without thinking about the bigger picture in terms of, absolutely, we need to have the right skills to do the right jobs, and jobs are changing, and roles are changing, and the world is changing, as it has as always, but it's just faster now. But thinking that focusing on the skills agenda only as a solution, is the classic, the hammer and nail issue, really, because it's a lot more than skills. And then underpinning that is, if you put your 70-20-10 glasses on, you understand that we do need capability. Of course, we need capability. Yep. Developing capability isn't just about rolling out a new first-level manager program, or isn't just about rolling out a new sales program, or whatever it is. It's about taking a systemic view, and actually our methodology talks about planning for the 100, starting with the 70. Yeah. And so if you're looking at solving a problem, you should be looking across the whole board in terms of how we can make sure that we have everything in place for that continuous improvement, or that improvement. And we start with the 70 because learning as part of work is usually more effective than learning away from work. And we know that goes back to research that was carried out 120 years ago. Yeah. There was some work, a couple of psychologists, eminent psychologists in America, developed the theory of identical elements, and called Thorndike and Woodworth with their names. And the Thorndike and Woodworth theory is really about transfer. And what they identified was that the more elements that are identical in the environment in which you learn to do something, your training environment, and the environment where you carry out the work, the more identical they are, the less transfer that will be needed, and the more effective it's going to be. So if you learn to do something in the context of where you're going to use it, you're more likely to be able to develop that capability. Definitely. The greater difference, the more problems you have, and that, I find that really interesting, Rob, because if I were to put my cynical hat on, I would say that it's interesting that our whole industry of learning and development professionals, a lot of us haven't really got that. 100 that bit of research, 1901, that research was first published. Yeah. We haven't really got that. And if we had, we'd say, okay, well, maybe we can just help people do their jobs better by making sure that we're supporting them in the workplace. We might be providing in all sorts of ways. And that will be more effective than bringing them off and putting them through a training program and putting them back in without changing the environment and hoping that magic had happened, because magic generally doesn't happen.
Absolutely. I mean, what I particularly like about this way of working, I think in the institute's way of describing it, it's around the performance detectives actually really getting involved into what's going on and what the blockers are. One of my first questions when I've kind of done that consultancy in the BP role, the business partner role, has been from that 70 angle. If you didn't have an L&D team, but you still had this challenge, what are the things that you might do to try and solve this? And then, brilliant, how can we help you do those? And in that sense, the comparison I've used quite a lot is that instead of being the kind of the pharmacist that just hands out lots of pills or whatever it is that's behind the counter, like L&D tend to do, this is what I've got available, I'll give you something, see if it works. We should need to be more like the GP. And the GP that you go to, the doctor in the surgery where you go to and say, right, this is a number of symptoms that I have.
Yep.
I've come here to help you to diagnose what's going on. And very rarely you go to a doctor in a GP surgery and say, I want antibiotics. And they go, there you go. Thank you very much. I'll have the antibiotics. No, we don't go there. Tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
And you listen. And I think what's crucial to this conversation is that, yes, it might be that the GP goes, all right, it's only this. I'm going to send you to the pharmacist and this will sort you. Sometimes, AKA, training would work. But quite often what happens is the GP isn't the one that's able to solve your problem. But the GP will refer you to the people who can help you, but they've got the skill to recognize it. And I've seen it, certainly a lot of my experience has been in telecoms and call centers. And I go, there comes a point when you're trying to train someone on a system. And there comes a point where you have to draw a line and say, is it the system that's just too complicated to use, not the people that are using it aren't clever enough to do it?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think the point you've made there, the analogy of having a problem and going to see a doctor is a really good analogy, because we see so often in L&D, we see what I would call solutioneering. That is, the solution is constructed before we really know what the cause of the problem is. Mm-hmm. So, a manager, maybe in a call center or support center, will discover that maybe they're doing they're getting their analysis in terms of their NPS or whatever it happens to be, and they come to learning and development to say, look, our customers are not as happy as they should be. We're not getting through as much as we need to. Can you put on a training program without doing any of that performance detective work, without doing any analysis at all to understand what it is that's being done now, what's required, what's the gap, what are the the environmental factors, what are the influencing factors that might be causing this? Is it a lack of skills? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it because, as you say, it could be they don't have the right tools, they don't have the right support at the time, or it could be any number of things. And we solutioneer. And actually, one of the challenges I've seen is that the HR, in organizations that have HR business partners are often part of the problem, because they go and sit with their leadership team, and the leadership team will say, our sales figures are down, we need to update our sales training program. Again, solutioneering thinking that, well, we put everyone through the system, through the sales program, we'll update it and everything will be right. And often HR business partners, because they don't have any, for all sorts of reasons, don't have any understanding about performance consulting, performance detective work. And so they then become the couriers, and they bring the order back, to the L&D department and say, this senior leadership team wants a new training program on this. And immediately learning and development is on the back foot. So you have to get in early on to understand and help people understand, go through a discovery process to understand what's the cause of the issue, what's the thing you want to fix, or what is it that you want to enhance. Let's understand what the underlying factors are involved in this. And that's why we don't work with competencies, we don't work with skills, we work with critical tasks. And that makes life much easier to say, if you want this to be carried out, you want to execute these actions in the business, what are the critical tasks? What do people really need to do that will make a difference? And that requires L&D to really get into, to your earlier point, really get into understand the context of what people are doing in the workplace. And then you can start to unpick where the deficiencies are, where you can leverage things, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's something you actually said when I saw you down in London that time doing the talk. You actually said, if you ask a training consultant for training, guess what you get? You get training, and it's that takeaway menu of, you know what, well, this is what we do, choose something from it. It might not be a cheeseburger that you want, but if that's the closest thing, that's what we'll deliver. And I can actually remember, just to the point of where you're working, there was one situation, and I'll keep the names out of it for obvious purposes, but I will what I would say is that I wanted to introduce a way of working which was more around a role immersion style of introduction to a company. So people would go and sit with good examples of the people in that department who were doing a really good job, experienced, tenured staff, and learn the ropes that way. And I think, as you call it, the flipped classroom, would come back into that sort of safer environment to talk about it and share and all that sort of stuff. And one of the oppositions to that was, well, we can't do that because all the people who are really experienced, they've slipped into so many bad habits. We don't want the newbies learning that. And me, as this person who'd seen you and wanted to start working this way, went, that's interesting. Let's stop talking about this and let's start talking about that. What is the point in me training these people this way?
Yeah.
If by your own admission, they're going to come out and learn bad habits. Why do people learn bad habits? What's behind that?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's, that is one of the barriers that L&D faces, because unless you actually understand exactly what's required, what the critical tasks that need to be executed, and then map what's being done against that, you're sort of flying blind, I think. And stepping back to thinking about, this order taking and this ordering. David Wilson once used this term, which I really like, which was the conspiracy of convenience. And I still see it. We all still see it. And the conspiracy of convenience works like this. So a manager will see an issue, a problem, whatever it might be, and assumes that it's a problem that training can solve.
Yeah.
So the assumption is this support center isn't hitting its figures, or this sales group isn't hitting its figures, or whatever it happens to be. And therefore they assume that it's a training problem. And so they then say to an L&D manager, we want you to design a program, course, whatever it happens to be, e-learning or whatever, to solve this problem. The L&D manager, the training manager, that's their job. Their job is designing training and learning and development. So they take the order and they say, great, thank you. And so they design the program or the course or the e-learning or whatever. That's delivered. Everyone's happy, nothing happens. So that's why it's a conspiracy. So, nothing happens, everyone's happy. And then a year later, the manager comes along and says, well, that training didn't work. We'd like you to do it again. And around we go. And it's so, we've all been there. We've seen it again and again. And again,
I still get a nervous twitch when I hear the word retrain.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that's right. So, you should never retrain. You've obviously done the wrong thing. So it's a major challenge. And actually for me, the leaders, team leaders and managers are so critical in this process. And in fact, when I was at Reuters, we did some research with the Corporate Executive Board, which is now part of Gartner Group. And we and 14 other companies, I think there were 15 global organizations involved altogether, identified those managers and team leaders who are seen as being focused and effective at developing their people, and those who are seen as being not focused and ineffective. And the researchers gave us various instruments. We looked at, we had anonymous 360 feedbacks from their teams and their own managers. We collected data from their performance reviews and things like that. And when the researchers analyzed that data, it was really interesting. They found that managers who are effective and focused at developing their people those people, those teams outperform others, those who work for managers who aren't effective at developing and supporting the development of their people by, well, they did the surveys twice, and I always put it in this context. It's round about a day and a bit a week extra work. So I've often said to groups of managers, how would you like everyone in your organization to do an extra day's work a week? What would that feel like? There's no catch here. You don't have to pay anyone more money. No one's going to work any longer. Simply make sure that managers are effective and focused at developing their people. And when we talk about being effective and focused at developing people, it's not about sending them on training programs.
Yeah.
It's about giving them, because there was another bit of work that the Corporate Leadership Council did, where they had 15 characteristics or 15 actions that leaders and managers could take that improve performance. And some of them are really, and there were 3 that stood out and a couple that didn't stand out. But things like feedback was reasonably important, but wasn't critical. In fact, feedback on personality traits, that's like me saying to you, Rob, you're a really good communicator, Rob. So when we're working on a new project and we need someone to work with other teams, you're the guy. That's sort of feedback on personality traits. Mm-hmm. But feedback on performance had some impact, but it wasn't one of the top 3. The top 3 were managers who did this, their teams really flew, were making sure that people were very clear about their objectives and how they were going to be measured. And that was reinforced. So you knew what you expected of you and how you're going to be measured. And I mean, we've all been there. I mean, anyone who's ever sat on an HR management committee would have seen this, where someone's appeared after the annual or the half-yearly performance review and appeared at HR and said, I've got a complaint because I've been graded, for those organizations that use grading systems. Thankfully, they're disappearing finally, but where someone said, I've been graded a 3 and I should be a 2. And the answer is, well, if your manager and you hadn't regularly had conversations and you didn't know a 3 was coming your way, that's maybe partly due to your performance, but also partly due to your manager. Yeah. Your manager's not doing that. So setting clear objectives and making sure that people know what's expected of them and how they're going to be measured was one of the top things. And the other 2, which are up there with, and all of these had the impact of about just a bit under 20% performance improvement, which is really huge. Yeah. The other 2 were linked together. One was the opportunity for challenging work, new experiences, new challenges. And linked to that was what they called the opportunity for learning, which is all about reflection. So if I, as a manager, stretch people, and I also then gave them some time to reflect on how things were going, what had gone well, what hadn't gone well, what they'd do better next time, those sorts of simple questions. Those 3 things were really, each of those had an impact of an uplift of around about a bit under 20%. And for me, what that says, Rob, is if you're a leader or a manager, first of all, you have to break this false trade-off. And the false trade-off is operational excellence versus developing your people. We've all seen so many managers would say, well, I don't have time to develop my people. They turn to HR and L&D, say, you fix it. Well, actually, good managers, good leaders don't have that false trade-off. They see that their job is obviously operational excellence. I mean, I've got to hit my targets. I might have a bonus hanging on that. We've got to do what we've got to do. But it's not a trade-off, because if you don't also, as part of your daily job as a manager or leader, if you don't focus on how you can stretch, encourage, support, give space for reflection to your team members, a number of things are going to happen. First of all, they won't perform as well. And secondly, you'll find that one of the key reasons that people leave an organization is they leave a manager. One of the key reasons they leave a manager is because they felt there's not an opportunity for them to develop. Yeah. So if you're a manager that has that trade-off saying, I can't develop my people, I rely on L&D to do that, I'm going to find that that's a very poor strategic decision, because the high-performing people will leave because, and the people who are on a trajectory upwards will leave because they feel they're not getting developed. And so it's really, really important. Managers are really important to make sure that we create this culture of continuous improvement. And I don't like the term, and certainly my colleagues, we tend not to use the term learning culture, because learning culture is often formal learning culture as opposed to a real learning culture. And the term that we tend to use is creating a culture of continuous improvement. So if we're thinking about, and if you talk to anyone who works in process, in lean or agile or whatever, they sort of get this immediately. But really what we're about is how can we help people continually improve day to day to day, to get better at doing a job. And, that's what we all want to do. And we get better by, working, by challenging experiences, by reflecting on that. And those are the things. And in fact, when I was a schoolboy, I went to a boarding school in Sydney, and my housemaster was an absolutely superb rowing coach. He had huge success as a rowing coach. And not long before he died, he wrote a book about coaching young men rowing. And in it, he quoted another famous Australian rower who talked about the fact that you don't learn to race. You don't learn to race by rowing. You learn to row by racing. And the principle was, actually, if you're going to become an elite sports person, an elite rower, what you have to do is you have to race. All the practice in the world will not produce, elite performance. And I was talking to a group of sports coaches, senior sports coaches, a few months ago, and they were very senior people. There was a guy who was the head coach for Irish rugby, and there was a deputy coach for the number 2 coach for the Australian cricket team, and a lot of UK Premier, English Premier League coaches and coach development managers. And this stuff to them is like, of course. Isn't that what everyone does? And the answer is, if you're working as an elite coach, you know this stuff. And they talk about match fitness. They know, if you think about football, you can have people who have all the skills in the world, but unless they get out there and practice and work at it, and they lose their match fitness. And yet, when we think about away from the sporting field and we think about our jobs, whether it's in telecoms or whether it's in retail or whether it's in financial services or pharma or government or whatever, we tend to forget those really basic principles about where people really achieve excellence is by doing the stuff and getting some support doing it, and time to reflect, and just sitting down with colleagues and managers and saying, how did this go? Did it work well? Didn't it? What will we do next time? What do we learn from that? Let's make sure we do it better next time. And we tend to forget that. So L&D gets into this cycle of designing, developing, delivering. A lot of it's what I'd call busy work. In fact, one of my
very busy work.
I work with a great American guy who was one of the heads of learning when I was at Reuters, a guy called Rich Taylor, who's still very active in this L&D world. And Rich always talked about busy work. And I think it's right, where we do a lot of stuff, but actually it doesn't produce necessarily any difference. And I think, just going around the circle, getting back to the whole 70-20-10 approach, that for me is about opening up all sorts of different ways in which we can support organizations to get better at what they do, be more agile, innovate more highly. And again, it bothers me a little bit. I think it's great that people are focused on behaviors. It's great that people are focused on curiosity, but they are just sort of waypoints in terms of getting to high levels of innovation, getting to high levels of performance. So, there's a whole lot of stuff that we can do, which can, if we move from the learning mindset to the performance mindset, we're on the right path for sure.
Well, it's the guiding thing. I often say that it tends to be that in business that leaders will wait for HR and L&D to tell them they need the leader to do something for the people, whereas it should be that the leader should be going, how can I utilize HR and L&D? What do I need from them to help me lead my people? I think the sporting analogies are very strong. I use one in one of the webinars that I run, where I ask people to say, if a football team is not performing, if everything's just gone wrong and they're plummeting down the league, who do you blame out of these four people? And I've got the owner, I've got the manager, I've got the training and coaching staff, and the players themselves. And the majority of the manager, because that's football, the manager's fault. The manager's the one telling the coaches and trainers what to do, telling the players what to do, blah blah blah. Some people go depending on the club. It could be the owner. The owner's the manager's great, it's the owner. But no one ever chooses the training and coaching staff, because their work clearly and obviously, to use your phrase, is getting those people match fit, match ready, drilling the things they need to be able to do, so it becomes natural in the performance. Whereas if we go back to the kind of business world, it tends to be the opposite. That it tends to be, well, this isn't going right, who should we get rid of? Should it be the owner? Should it be the manager? Or should it be the player? Get rid of the training team, restructure that. Something's not working. Which kind of brings me to my next question, that you've talked about how 70-20-10 should work then, and it all makes complete sense to me. However, we've also touched on the fact that the L&D teams aren't working in those performance detective type ways, and we're also touching on the fact that the things that great leaders could be doing and do, why aren't L&D and leaders doing these things? What's stopping them? What's getting in the way?
It's a really good question. I think part of it is historical, because L&D, as we said earlier on, came out of training. Training, was developed way back as sort of a way that we took people away from work and we put them through some process. And I quite often joke, although only partially joke, the fact that we're still using the concept of curriculum. We might not call it curriculum, we call it learning pathways. The concept of curriculum was developed in the 18th century. The Prussian army got beaten by the French in the late 1700s. And the leaders of the Prussian army sort of took a step back and thought, what do we need to do differently? And they realized that they've been training their soldiers to march in straight lines, and that actually they probably needed to do more than teach soldiers to march in straight lines. So they developed this concept of the curriculum. And it was picked up by an American psychologist and taken to the US, and the rest is history. So we still have this key component of what we do as L&D is based on an 18th century concept. We mightn't call it the curriculum. We probably call it learning pathways. We might have academies that we built around it and so on. But basically, it's built on this concept that we can fix people without fixing the environment or separate from the environment. And for me, that really, we just need to break out of that. We need to think about what it is, and we need to break out of that. And we also need to break out of the fact that we're focusing just on people, because again, I think a lot of L&D, a lot of the challenges for L&D professionals, and to a certain extent, I would, if I had to point a finger, I don't like doing it, but I think I would, I'd point it at the HR department, because the HR department, by the nature of where HR has come from, it used to be called personnel, i.e. they're focused on people, on individuals. So a lot of the processes that HR undertakes is around individuals. And L&D has sort of caught that disease to a certain extent. And L&D needs to think about the organization. We need to think about how we help teams. How do we help, bits of the business, might be a division or it could be whatever. We need to think about the bigger picture. And I'm always surprised when I look at learning strategies, and even some of the big consultancies, you sometimes get an insight into a learning strategy that's been built by one of the big consultancies. And it's still all focused on individual development. It's still focused on principally on formal learning. It might touch on what we call 10 plus, and 10 plus is great. I would describe 10 plus as being the opportunity to create formal learning really well. In other words, you exploit some social aspects, you maybe exploit some work that's going on in the workplace, but it's still very structured. It's not what I'd call, or what we would call 70-20-10. But I think that the challenge that L&D has is stepping out of that straitjacket of designing, developing, delivering training programs, whether they're called executive development programs or whether they're called functional training programs or whatever. We need to do that. I'm not saying that put those to one side. We certainly shouldn't. But that's only a bit of what we need to do. And it's only when learning and development professionals can step up and out, are they really going to help develop expertise across their organization and help their organizations grow and change? Because
who do you think's got the kind of the key to the locks that are on those straitjackets? Who's keeping L&D nice and tightly wound up there and carrying them on, delivering the training?
Oh, I think there's a number of actors there that are doing that. One is L&D itself.
Yeah.
Because in a way, it's quite comfortable. You come to work, or nowadays you log on, and you're involved in designing, or updating a new program or a new e-learning. You're doing some instructional design around an e-learning program, or you're producing content or whatever it is. So in a way, L&D themselves don't see the issue and don't get out and don't use, the tools, for example, in our methodology where we have these 5 roles. You're not carrying out the performance detective role, the architect. You're sort of stuck in that world of, we're designing the training. But I wouldn't put the blame absolutely at the feet of L&D, all of it, because actually they're forced into that corner by, as I mentioned, by I think HR business partners really need to understand, and there are some which are great. Some organizations really get this and do it. And make sure that they're not just order takers in terms of, working with their business teams and coming back with their list of, with their itemized list of the training they need.
Yeah.
But managers are really critical, because managers have the visibility. If you think about the amount of time that anyone spends in formal training activities in a year, it's pretty small. The amount of time they spend working is, orders of magnitude greater than that. Who has the visibility over people when they're working? The answer is their colleagues and their first line manager, whatever that is. It doesn't matter whether you are a senior manager and a board member. The CEO, if you're the CFO, the CEO will have oversight in terms of what you do. Or it doesn't matter if you're an individual contributor and you've got a team leader. So those people really need to understand that their responsibility is twofold. And I mentioned this before. It's operational excellence and making sure that your people are continuously improving and understanding what it is your people need to continuously improve. And part of that might be capability development, but part of it might be just getting out of the way, getting stuff out of the way, making sure that the processes are clear, making sure that that they've got clarity and rounds of expectations, that the critical tasks are identified. They know what's really important and what isn't, and that sort of stuff. It's not rocket science. It's basic stuff. But if we know that, and our experience is that if you look at almost any role and you find an exemplary performer, you find a top performer, and you ask them what it is they do, and even better if you observe them, what they're doing, you almost invariably find that there are a few things that they do which would be considered to be, which are critical tasks. They execute those critical tasks well. And often what they do in order to execute those is not necessarily the way they've been taught it. And often we see this, standard operating procedures. You talk to a high performer and you say, how useful are the standard operating procedures? And they would say, well, yeah, these are fine, but actually I've got to work around for this because that's rubbish. That's a waste of time. And so often when you look at SOP training, it's not a matter of just serving up more SOP training. It's about understanding which of those standard operating procedures are really critical, which need changing, which need updating. I would say that learning and development could produce far greater value if they focused on things like that. If you're working in an area, say you're working in a highly compliant environment or a highly regulated environment where you sort of live and die by standard operating procedures, you might be in a nuclear power plant or in a production line or whatever. It could be anything. If you focus on how aligned are the standard operating procedures with what work that's getting done? Do people understand the critical things they need to do? All that sort of stuff. And then maybe you're building support around that. And this is why, a lot of the 70-20-10, the learning in the workplace, people often think it's, well, we can just provide performance support. Performance support is one thing that we can do. And I think performance support has been underrated for years and years. And I've seen examples, I was involved in the example where I was asked to provide trainers for an upgrade of an SAP system. And I was told by the program manager that that people across the world would need 2 days training if they were in sales and 1 day's training if they were in service and support. And I looked at this guy and I said, "Are you crazy?" Well, I didn't quite say that, but I implied it. I said, "We don't even know what the problem is yet. Let's try and work out what the problem is."
Yeah.
And I flatly refused to do this. I refused that my team would do it. And the outcome was that the company went and engaged an external provider who were quite happy to do it.
Yeah.
At one stage, they had 47 trainers flying around the world running these 2-day training programs and these 1-day training programs for this upgrade. This was obviously before the upgrade occurred, so no one had seen what the environment looked like.
I'm just seeing dollar signs.
Yeah, that's right. And I asked one of my teams to develop some performance support content, and they did. They produced about 60 little, at the time they were using Captivate, these sort of quick step-throughs for following these processes. About 60, they grouped them into different groups and they put them on the intranet, and they got hammered by people over the next year or so. And the cost of the external training was somewhere around, I think, about $1 million, maybe a bit under $1 million. The cost of doing this performance support was about 3 weeks' work from 2 or 3 people, which certainly wasn't $1 million. The impact in terms of supporting people being able to use these new systems was huge compared with the external training, because the decks, I saw some of the decks for these 2 days training, there were 400 PowerPoint slides.
Wow.
The idea that, and there were screenshots of systems some of which were going to change before they went live. And we've all been there, we've all seen that.
Well, and in many ways, the trap, one of the traps inside of that is something that I talk about, that it almost becomes that training teams become a glorified comms team. And realistically, when you've got a bunch of slides showing screenshots of a screen that doesn't actually exist yet or isn't finalized yet, you are just communicating what something's going to look like. You can't, you're not doing anything else. You're not practicing or preparing to use it. And in many ways, even if you had that system in a training room, I've compared it, I think you've mentioned cycling once, that you're learning to ride a bike. You do that in a training room. Well, that's cool. You're not going to get very far. You're not going to get the chance to fall off, probably. It's not big enough. But then, even if it was, you don't get the rain, you don't get the leaves on the road, you don't get the cars cutting you up, you don't get any of that stuff that's going to happen once you're out there. So what is it really we can do in this training bit right here? And it's not, glorified comms doesn't really do anything other than cost a lot.
Sure, that's right, yeah. And absolutely, and it goes back to Thorndike and Woodworth, 1901, identical elements. The research showed us that performance in a training environment does not replicate in the real environment. So the correlation between the two is not necessarily great. So if someone can perform in a training room, don't expect that's automatically going to be transferred across to the real environment, because the more differences you have, the more the transfer is more difficult.
Absolutely.
So well, why wouldn't you just try and get rid of the transfer and just give people support in the workplace?
Yeah. It's like an induction is very much almost like, in week 1, we're going to look at eggs. In week 2, we're going to look at pans. And in week 3, we're going to look at cheese. And then in week 4, you're going live and you're making cheese omelets. And you're like, what? How do I do that?
That's right. Yeah. No, absolutely.
You mentioned like the blockers and that, kind of bringing it to a close in terms of back into leadership. You've mentioned that one of the things there is that those standard operating procedures. You touched on targets and bonuses. And I've certainly witnessed that despite the best intent and the best L&D work and the best HR work, and even leaders who I'm witnessing now want to lead in a different way, it sometimes comes down to a choice between getting the bonus or not getting the bonus. So I'm actually not going to, I see the point and I see the merit in having a bunch of coaching conversations with my staff over there right now. However, if I do that, I know we're not going to hit the targets because I'm taking them off the phones or I'm not supporting them in that way. Carry on. Let's hit it and forget about that. because we all need our bonus. Do you find that a lot, that that's a key thing that takes people away from, I don't want to say necessarily the right thing to do, but it certainly is the path towards the right thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to this false trade-off. You cannot see it. If you're a manager or a leader, you cannot see this trade-off between, the bonus, which is tactical. Bonus is usually based on an annual cycle. So operational excellence and developing your people.
Yeah.
Developing your people is a strategy, because if you don't develop your people, they'll leave. They won't perform to their optimum level. It'll become more difficult for you to hit your bonus next year and the year after, because people will say, I don't want to work with that guy. I don't want to join that team because I'm not going to get the opportunity to develop. So it's really it's an absolute false trade-off. And to be honest, just a sort of an anecdote on that, one of the best experiences I've had this was when I was at Reuters, and we had a major challenge, or we had a challenge with our customer support teams. And we were spending lots of money in terms of training them, and there was still the customer feedback we were getting wasn't all that great. And I sat down with the global head of customer service to map out what we would do differently, how we would actually really get these teams sorted out. And we had support teams in London, in St. Louis, in Sydney, Australia, and in Geneva. Yeah. And we worked through, and the global head of support said, we talked about it. We said, that's okay. And I said to him, okay, Richard, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to measure this? Because I'd always had the view that, creating metrics, some sort of learning metrics is sort of a waste of time. It might be useful for us as L&D people, but actually we needed to understand what the business metric was. And he said, there's only one metric that matters to me. And he said, that's the CSR, the customer satisfaction rate. He said, my bonus, 18% of my bonus is on moving the CSR up 3% this year.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he said, Charles, I've got an idea. Would you be prepared to put 18% of your bonus on moving the CSR rate up 3% for the support centres? Mm-hmm. And I said, absolutely. And so my bonus, 18% of my bonus was put to moving the CSR rate up. Of course, what I did was I then went and had a conversation with my head of sales and service learning, his team was doing all this work. And I said, Steve, we're going to change your bonus structure. We're going to get 6 to 18% of your bonus is going to be on this. And Richard Bevan, this chap, who's a great guy, who he went to his regional heads of support, customer support. He bonused them 18% on CSR. And it was the only time in my career when I knew that I had 18% of my bonus in my back pocket by the end of August. Because, of course, we were all aligned with doing, our focus was how are we going to, and of course, we had an external company that was gathering this data, and they'd report back every 2 weeks, and we'd pore over the figures and look out, or maybe tweak it this way or tweak it that way. And of course, it's obvious we were all aligned with absolutely the same thing.
Well, it pushes collaboration in that sense, because instead of that solutionizing you talked about earlier on, and how do I hit my individual target that may or may not be aligned, I don't really care because I just want to make my target. Suddenly the question starts to drive, well, even if I hit my individual target, that doesn't mean we're going to hit the thing that gives me my bonus. So how can we work together to make sure we all hit this to get that figure to move? And then, I do see some, I more regularly hear it coined as CSAT, the customer satisfaction. And I do see companies that factor that into the bonus schemes. But I also then see a second and a third piece that still provides a choice. So if I do this now, the customer might not be fully satisfied if it goes wrong, but I've got more chance of getting my bonus if I leave now, because I won't go over the time it should have taken me to solve the problem. So I'll just hope it doesn't break in the next 30 days, something like that. Whereas if it's purely on customer satisfaction, as you were talking about there, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this works for the customer.
That's right. Yeah, and it also drives, focusing on the CSR, the CSAT, also drives everyone into co-creation. So it's not just about L&D providing a solution, providing a service. It's all about, and in fact, again, our 70-20-10 methodology is all about co-creation, because, the context of what is needed, the people who are working, day to day, whether they're managers, leaders, or whatever, they actually know far more than L&D will ever know. So when you're producing solutions, when you're producing whatever it is that's going to enable this to get better, you need to co-create. And one of the parts of the process of the methodology we have is when that performance detective work is done, you engage with your client. So if I'm called in, or you're called in to work on a challenging problem, one of the early questions you ask is, are you prepared to look at non-training solutions to solve this problem? And that surfaces a lot of stuff. That's really important, because as soon as just that question, and you can talk about it, and invariably, I think it would only be a fool that would say no. It opens up all sorts of opportunities to actually say, okay, we're going to create the solution with you. We're going to make sure this works, and it does. It works.
100%. Everyone is responsible for that, and working together can only be a good thing. It can only be a good thing. Co-create. We've come to the part of the show then, Charles, that we kind of look back and go, what we've been talking about. And I've got a bunch of notes on my little piece of paper here that I keep next to me at all times. Leadership Untitled. Based on what we've been talking about, what we think a good title for the show would be. Based on what we've been talking about, what sort of ideas might you have flying around?
Well, I think in terms of leadership, for me, leadership behaviors are really critical in a number of ways. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, leaders in terms of no trade-off, no false trade-off. Don't try and trade off operational excellence versus develop your own people. That's one thing that's important. And also, leadership is really critical, because organizations will not improve unless leaders create the environment of psychological safety, for want of a better word. In other words, I've got to feel safe to do things differently, I've got to be safe to question things, to challenge things, but even to the extent of, if I'm a learning leader, be prepared to push back with a manager or a leader who comes and says we need a new training course on X, which happens a lot, and just say, okay, look, that's a good idea, great, but let's just talk about this, because that's not enough. And being able to push back in a nice, gentle way to say, actually, that's not the way we're going to work. We're going to do things differently. So I think in terms of a title, maybe I need a new training course on X would be a good title for it, because that's the challenge. That's one of the challenges that we're facing with managers and leaders, or else another title might be learning isn't schooling. Back to Jay Cross, Jay's term, because again, I think that's a major problem that we have. And to a certain extent, I fear that the whole academy structures, I've seen academies do some great stuff in organizations, but it does bother me a little bit, because academies are like universities or colleges within the business. And actually, we don't need universities and colleges within the business. What we need is L&D professionals who can help people do their jobs better, who can help teams do their jobs better, achieve their objectives, and who can help their organizations be more effective, more efficient, innovate more rapidly, change their business models, all this sort of stuff. And that's what it's all about. It's not about taking schooling or college or whatever and building some sort of nice environment where people can come away and come on their leadership development programs and have a great time and meet people, which is great. I mean, I don't want to diss that. I know that we learn a lot from that, but that's not what we should be all about. That's a small bit of what we should be doing.
So I've, based on what you've just said, I've narrowed it down to two.
Right.
And you can cast the deciding vote here then, Charles. I've got learning isn't schooling or the false trade-off.
That's good. Oh, it'll be a toss of a coin, really. I think learning isn't schooling would be good. And I just like to sort of put a marker up to J Cross, because that's, it just is stuck with me so strongly, that because that underpinned what actually Jay was just finishing he was working on his last book when he died in 2015, called Real Learning. And that was that was all about what real learning is about. And I think what we've been talking about over the last hour or so is about real learning.
Cool. I'll put that marker onto J Cross on there as well, so people know that. If people would like to follow you, Charles, and get in touch about what the institute's doing, or just follow you to see what you're talking about or doing, how can they do that? What's the best way?
There's a number of ways. They can, if they want to get in contact with me personally, they just get onto me on LinkedIn. Find me easily. Twitter, I'm just at Charles Jennings at Twitter. That's fine. If they want to see maybe some papers and some thinking, they either go to the 702010institute.com or tulser.com. That's TULSER, which is an anagram of result. And that's we've moved away from 70-20-10 to an extent because of the issues we've been talking about. And we now talk about performance-based learning. And Tulser is all about results and all about performance-based learning. Fantastic. So any one of those is fine to get in contact with me or my colleagues.
I'll put some links to those places. I'll put it on the screen for those seeing it on the YouTube, but also I'll put it in the comments for people to be able to click on and shoot straight off to those things. What I just want to let the audience know that are watching on YouTube, that Charles has got a big bookcase behind him, and I'm going to set him a challenge, because I said to Charles that I think you're the only person, Charles, who's got the bookcase full of books behind them who I actually trust has read all those books and isn't just using it for show. And then you told me that you've actually got one book on there that you haven't read yet. So there's your challenge. Next time we speak, I want you to let me know.
No, I should say, if you're looking at the bookcase behind me, it's the biggest book as well. So that's the
biggest one. Yeah, go for it. Drop it in the comments if you think you know which one it is. Brilliant. Thanks again so much for agreeing to come on today. I've had a thoroughly great, really enjoyed that conversation, and I think that's really useful for our listeners. So thank you, Charles.
It's been a real pleasure, Rob. Thanks very much.
Great stuff. Have a great day. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Leadership Untitled podcast. Today's episode will be called Learning Isn't Schooling. All that remains is for me to again thank Charles for joining me today and sharing all his experiences and insights, and obviously you guys for listening. If you'd like to keep in touch, or you'd like to actually follow the show, then please subscribe for future episodes, but also drop me a line if I can help you at all. rob@robmores.com is the email, but also the website of the same name, www.robmores.com. Speak soon.